morning, everybody. Hope you're having a wonderful day, because it is a beautiful day out there. If Marilyn and Megan are in the crowd. Is Megan here? I don't see Megan. So I would ask that Marilyn Poitras please come down, and I will introduce you to Marilyn. Marilyn Poitras is from Saskatchewan, so I hold her near and dear to my heart. And I'm welcoming her here to Wolastoqey territory and acknowledging our own territory back in Saskatchewan in Treaty 6 and Treaty 4 on the homeland of the Métis Nation, where we're from. Marilyn Poitras joined the University of Saskatchewan in 2009, and prior to her appointment there, her professional life was a fusion of law, governance, community, and institutional education. Her expertise and passion is around constitutional and Aboriginal law with a life study in customary laws. Marilyn's legal career began as a Native court worker, and it moved into the area of constitutional law after her articles with the Saskatchewan Department of Justice. She has developed a number of legal education initiatives, including the precursor to the Asquith Law School in Nunavut, where she also has been a professor, and the Indigenous Peoples Resource Management Program at the University of Saskatchewan. And I know also that she worked in law and governance at the University of Victoria as well. Marilyn has worked in private practice and litigated at every court level in Canada. She has significant experience in the development of self-government with the Beaufort Delta Agreement, treaty implementation with the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations Treaty Table Justice Portfolio, as well as revisions to the Saskatchewan Métis election process. Marilyn also works on the CETA-funded research on ancestral domain and land conflict in central Mindanao. As you may or may not know, Marilyn was a commissioner with the Commission on the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women in Canada, and she has done a lot of work around the issue of violence against women and the issue of missing and murdered women and the systemic problems really that we're dealing with in Canada and worldwide. So she has worked on that. She has dedicated, really, I would say, her life to the elevation of elder knowledge and the inclusion of elders in everything that she does. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about Marilyn. Lastly, I would like to just say that she has 4 children, and those are the people, along with her other family, that keep her laughing, rounded, grounded, and real. Welcome, Marilyn.
Is Kathleen here?
Kathleen is here. Kathleen Mahoney is right here.
So sorry.
So just the program.
My apologies, audience. This is what happens when you are an assistant professor multitasking on numerous things. Welcome, Kathleen Mahoney. Nice to meet you. Professor Mahoney has a JD from the University of British Columbia, an LLM degree from Cambridge University, and a diploma in International Cooperative Human Rights from Strasbourg International Human Rights Institute in France. She is a professor of law at the University of Calgary and Queen's Counsel. She was the chief negotiator for Canada's Aboriginal people's claim for cultural genocide against Canada, achieving the largest financial settlement in Canadian history for the mass human rights violations against Indigenous peoples of Canada. She was the primary architect of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and she led negotiations for the historic apology from the Canadian Parliament and from Pope Benedict at the Vatican. She was a co-counsel for Bosnia-Herzegovina in their genocide action against Serbia in the International Court of Justice, with the result that the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention was altered to include mass rapes and forced pregnancy as genocide offenses. Among her many awards and distinctions, Professor Mahoney is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, Queen's Counsel, a Trudeau Fellow, and a Fulbright and Human Rights Fellow from Harvard. She received the Governor-General's Medal for her contribution to equality in Canada. She also has held visiting professorships and fellowships at Harvard University, the University of Chicago, Adelaide University, University of Western Australia, Griffith University, and the National University of Australia and Ulster University. Welcome so much to Wolastoqey Territory, Kathleen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. It was very kind. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the organizers of this conference. I'm really happy to be here to celebrate with you the peace and friendship treaties of the area. I thank the elders for your prayers and blessings and for the smudge ceremony. It was very nice. And I would like to acknowledge as well the Wabanaki Territory, which has given us the honor and privilege of being here today. So what I'm going to talk about today is reconciliation, recognition, and the rule of law. In my talk, what I'm going to emphasize is that Canada's failure to recognize the importance and contributions of Indigenous peoples to the founding of our nation, the legal structure which allowed this to occur and continues to allow it to occur, the consequences of the failure to recognize, and I'm going to finish, hopefully on a positive note, as to a project that's ongoing to try and pressure the federal government into some action on this matter. So, the 150th anniversary of Confederation celebrations are just about over. I do have a PowerPoint here that I want to show you too. Okay. Can't have a talk without pictures. I've sort of convinced myself of that because I really like making PowerPoints. It was working when we downloaded it.
The system's a little dated, I was told,
Okay.
so.
I love your glasses.
Oh, thank you. Here he comes.
Okay, I guess you some time.
You had them blank?
Yeah.
Okay, you got put your mute on. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll just start again. I started by saying the 150th anniversary of Confederation this year, 2017. These celebrations have just about concluded. The nationwide celebrations we have experienced thus far this year all reinforce the story of Canada's birth, or in other words, its origin story. This story says that we are a nation founded by two peoples, the British and the French, and that is forever immortalized in the British North America Act, which is a picture here, whose promise is peace, order, and good government for all. Now, this constitutional document is held up as a monumental achievement forming the bedrock of Canadian identity, as well as the foundation for the rule of law and the free and democratic nation we believe ourselves to be. But here's the problem, and this is the topic of my lecture today. Canada's origin story is wrong. In 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples identified this problem, and they wrote, "A country cannot be built on a living lie." My argument is that Canada's origin story is wrong because it fails to recognize that Indigenous peoples are every bit as integral to Canada's origin story as the French and the British are. Without the enormous contributions of the Indigenous peoples, Canada would not exist as it does today. For reconciliation to have any chance of happening, in my view, this great misconception must be corrected through legislation recognizing Canada as a country of three founding peoples: the British, the French, and the Indigenous. Moreover, as the rule of law is at the very heart of Confederation, it must be rethought as well, because its application to Indigenous peoples for the past 150 years has been dysfunctional, mired in racism and inequality. Constitutions set out the rules by which people are governed. They form the social contract between the governed and those who govern, and it is those relationships that make for a healthy and well-functioning society. Rethinking the rule of law by legislatively recognizing Indigenous peoples' role in Confederation would create a path towards explicit recognition of Indigenous rights, Indigenous legal traditions in Canada's constitutional framework, and self-determination and the sovereignty of which we heard yesterday. In addition to being a historic correction and a triumph for human rights, such formal recognition would provide irrefutable justification for recognition of inherent Indigenous rights, including the right of self-determination, which encompasses the protection and strengthening of Indigenous languages, cultures, legal traditions, and institutions. Now, 50 years ago, on the 100th anniversary of Confederation, Chief Dan George, he was an acclaimed author, poet, actor, and First Nations leader. He rained on Canada's Confederation parade back then. He silenced a crowd, in fact, of 32,000 at Empire Stadium in Vancouver with his withering lament for Confederation, describing Canada's appalling and discriminatory treatment of Indigenous peoples, treatment we have now come to understand as cultural genocide. Although Chief Dan George has long since passed away, our understanding of Confederation and its implications have not changed in 150 years. Indigenous peoples' trust and confidence in the rule of law is even less than it was in the past. When governments impose laws and policies such as the Indian Act and its many iterations that consistently ignore the values and legal traditions of Indigenous peoples, it should not be surprising that Indigenous peoples feel less obliged to respect them as citizens ruled by laws which strengthen their social bonds. The loss of peace, order, and security that would have been enjoyed by Indigenous peoples had they been recognized as equal contributors to Confederation is an ongoing cause of grievance and injury. Legislative recognition of Indigenous peoples as founders of Canada would not only prominently remind Canadians of the historical facts of Indigenous peoples' role in making Canada possible, it would also expose deficiencies in the rule of law and our adherence to it. Recognition legislation would facilitate the rule of law's development by strengthening equality rights, enhancing the democratic nature of Canadian law, and providing a foundation for reconciliation. Now, I don't believe there is anything revolutionary about this proposal. The concept of recognition implies that accepted ideas are brought to awareness again. In 1982, the relationship between the Constitution and the Indigenous peoples of Canada was recognized when Parliament passed Sections 25 and 35 of the Constitution Act. And you can read there in Section 25A that the Constitution recognized the Royal Proclamation of October the 7th, 1763. And in Section 35, you can see that the Constitution recognized the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of all Aboriginal peoples of Canada. And in so doing, the Constitution implicitly embraced the idea that Indigenous peoples played a fundamental role in the foundation of Canada. And so I would argue that recognition legislation is therefore in harmony with Canada's existing constitutional obligations. What is lacking is explicit legislative recognition that Indigenous contributions were as important to the founding of Canada as the British and French contributions were. Now, some may argue that what I'm talking about here is constitutional amendment. I'm not, because in our experiences of the past, we know that that's very likely not to occur, to have a constitutional amendment, but I do believe that such legislation that I'm proposing, and it's not just me proposing it, but I'm giving this lecture today, so I'll say I, would amount to quasi-constitutional legislation that doesn't require a constitutional amendment, much like the Canadian Human Rights Act, for example, or the Supreme Court Act. These are pieces of legislation that have become constitutional by their very importance to Canada, and no parliament would dare to repeal such legislation unless they were on a political suicide mission, I think. So that's how I would argue that this legislation would be more than just simple legislation, that once passed, it would be extremely difficult for any government to say, no, we don't believe Indigenous peoples do have this importance in the Canadian identity and seek to repeal it. I don't think that would ever happen, but I think that's open for argument. I'll go on then. The importance of origin stories, like the origin of this country, cannot be underestimated. An origin story explains to everyone who is interested in it how a culture, or in this case, in our case, how a nation came into being. An origin story serves legal as well as epistemological and ontological functions, connecting our past to the present and explaining its relevance to everyday life helps us to navigate our relationships and to consider deep ethical questions about how we should conduct ourselves. Now, this famous slide is sort of the epitome of the Christian origin story, and you know how many times it's referred to when people are calling upon their fundamental values and ethical duties. When origin stories describe the beginnings of politics and power, they serve as scripts for citizenship, a form of consent to a political vision and the rule of law. A society with an origin story that excludes those who were foundational to its creation creates instability, anger, alienation, and disaffection. For the past several years, non-Indigenous citizens of Canada have gone through a painful, legal, and existential crisis with respect to our origin story and our relationship with Indigenous peoples. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the Government of Canada's apology in Parliament, the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all of these have revealed shocking facts that contradict the commonly held beliefs about Canada, its values, and the rule of law. The disconnect between our comfortable origin story and the cultural genocide perpetrated with impunity on Indigenous Canadians for almost 2 centuries destabilizes everything, from our understanding of ourselves, our values, and our confidence in the rule of law, and also our international reputation. The great African American writer James Baldwin's insight that people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them captures, I believe, our identity crisis and calls for some explanation and legal resolution. What most Canadians don't know is that the treaties that created Canada did so by applying and referring to Indigenous legal traditions. If Canadians had an understanding of Indigenous legal traditions and their importance in Canada's constitutional framework, deficiencies that lie in the common law and the civil law would be exposed. As John Burroughs points out, the reception of British and French law into Canada through the BNA Act was as culturally contingent to their home countries of origin as Indigenous laws were to theirs. Had Indigenous leaders been sitting at the Confederation table, a more pluralistic rule of law or multi-juridicalism would have emerged with the effect of strengthening all three legal traditions. Unless Canada's origin story acknowledges their contributions to the founding of the nation, it perpetuates a lie. To ignore the impact of hundreds of Indigenous nations with distinct cultures, legal traditions, and unique knowledge and understanding of this part of the world is simply illogical and unreasonable. Indigenous populations had laws, forms of governance, and spiritual traditions for thousands of years and still do. Moreover, Indigenous knowledge systems, languages, and forms of social organizations influenced the way settlers survived and prospered. The Indigenous population provided land for settlers, entered into trade agreements and peace and friendship treaties, as we've heard at this conference, and fought alongside them in colonial wars. From an economic perspective, the fur trade, the mainstay of colonial economies for more than 250 years, relied upon and depended upon the participation and cooperation of Indigenous peoples for its existence. The colonial project would never have succeeded without the fur trade. The fur trade also opened the continent to exploration and settlement, missionary work, and social and other forms of economic development. But by far the most significant contribution to the building of the nation and its economy was the vast tracts of land that Canada acquired through treaties, lands that have produced immense riches, making Canada one of the wealthiest nations in the world. So I draw your attention to this slide in particular, where you can see in stark reality the huge amount of land right through the boreal forest and all of the wealthy areas of Canada that produce our natural resources that have taken this country to its place in the world are all lands that were subject to treaties. So once the treaties were signed, the Indigenous laws and values they embodied, however, were ignored. Instead, the laws and policies of the British and the French were used to eliminate Indigenous nations as legal and political entities. It is no surprise then that at the Confederation table in 1867, there were no chairs for the Indigenous peoples. Instead of recognizing Indigenous rights, the Fathers of Confederation gave the federal government total control over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. After relegating Indigenous peoples to virtual non-citizen status, it became easy then for the Fathers of Confederation and subsequent governments to promote the myth that only the British and the French were responsible for the founding of Canada. Shortly after Confederation, the final nail was put into the coffin of the participation, the equal participation of the Indigenous population in the governance of Canada, and that was the Indian Act. It operationalized the structural inequality created by the BNA Act that persists, of course, to this day. As you heard yesterday, the Indian Act prohibited, amongst other things, voting, the hiring of lawyers to fight for land rights, fundraising for political reasons, traveling off reserve, cultural activities, and denied status for those who attended university. The unequal treatment of Indigenous peoples was legally and philosophically justified through the rule of law, and more particularly the discovery doctrine and the formal equality principle. Now, the doctrine of discovery was the legal fiction whereby Europeans claimed exclusive rights of sovereignty and ownership of lands they claimed to discover. Now, all of this originated back in around 1493 by Pope Alexander VI. What he did for the explorers under the sponsorship of the Vatican or of the Catholic Church was that he proclaimed that Christian explorers could colonize, convert, enslave, and claim ownership of lands anywhere in the Western world, as long as the people existing there were not Christian. This doctrine was handily adopted by the US Supreme Court some 350 years later, saying that those who lived on the land had rights of occupancy only, not ownership rights, which went to the discoverers. Under this legal rule, Indigenous peoples could not claim ownership of their lands, but only rights of occupation and use. And this principle still underlies the law today. Now, on top of that, the formal equality principle. Now, this principle originated in the teachings of Plato and Aristotle, so they're long-standing principles. Their definition of equality was that likes were to be treated alike. Those who were different from the dominant comparator group, or the normative standard, in other words, could be treated differently, and that would not violate the principle of equality. Now, the Fathers of Confederation embraced both the formal equality principle and the doctrine of discovery as fundamental to the rule of law. Formal equality, applied together with the doctrine of discovery, assured and justified legally the perpetual dominance of the British and the French over the land and the permanent subordination of the Indigenous peoples who occupied it. The Aristotelian formal equality principle underpinned as well the imposition of the Indian Act. As long as all Indians who were different than non-Indians were treated the same under the Act, formal equality standards were satisfied. Similarly, the Indian residential schools policy that treated Indian children differently compared to non-Native children would not have set off alarm bells at all. It was central to the operating formal equality principles of the government. The formal equality theory, and this famous slide, demonstrates exactly what the formal equality theory was all about, and the answer to the formal equality theory, if the government didn't feel comfortable with it, was to change those different little children into children that were the same as non-Indian children. And this picture speaks profoundly to that. So, the formal equality theory existed until the famous case of Andrews and the Law Society of British Columbia, which was decided in 1989. The court said there that the concept of formal equality is seriously deficient. The court said that it was so deficient, it could be used to justify the Nuremberg laws of Adolf Hitler, because similar treatment there in Germany during World War II and prior to World War II was contemplated for all Jews. As long as Jews were different from other German citizens, it was okay to treat them differently. The court went on to say, it was a wise man who said, there is no greater inequality than the equal treatment of unequals. The discovery doctrine, too, has been severely condemned as a socially unjust, racist concept in violation of basic and fundamental Indigenous human rights by legal experts and scholars. Several churches have officially discredited the doctrine, as has the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the United Nations Economic and Social Council. The Supreme Court of Canada has indicated that a judicial reassessment of the doctrine is underway. The court's comments in the unanimous judgments of Taku River Tlingit First Nation in British Columbia and Haida Nation versus British Columbia, where the first time it referred to pre-existing Aboriginal sovereignty, indicates a clear discomfort by the court with the discovery doctrine. Now, since these legal doctrines have been so widely discredited, it can no longer be said that the rule of law justifies their use. Nonetheless, until the origin story is changed, we will remain trapped in the narrow framework of an outdated and impoverished rule of law that has left Indigenous Canadians marginalized, dispossessed, and unrecognized, and the rest of us intellectually debilitated, morally disempowered, and personally depressed, wondering who we really are. The division between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada has grown increasingly deeper and more hostile since Confederation. Fueling the anger and dissatisfaction are disproportionate incarceration rates, suicide, poverty, high school dropout rates, missing and murdered Indigenous women, lower life expectancy, poor health, unemployment, and addictions add to this anger. The opportunity to set the record straight is upon us, I believe, as we reflect upon our past 150 years and contemplate our future 150 years. Our true origin story is a powerful narrative that, if adopted by law, will become a part of the shared story of every Canadian, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, for generations to come, and will open up possibilities for genuine and lasting reconciliation. Recognition, reconciliation, and the rule of law, I believe, go hand in hand. For the Parliament of Canada to recognize Indigenous peoples as fundamental to the founding of the nation would be a powerful, long overdue recognition and a powerful and profound gesture of reconciliation that will strengthen the rule of law and make us a better country. It would require the Government of Canada to treat the Indigenous population with the same resources, status, respect, and opportunity that it treats the rest of the population. With respect to language rights, as an example, you think about the efforts and resources the government puts into the preservation and promotion of the French language. If the Indigenous languages were accepted on an equal plane with the French languages, we would see a profound difference right there. And as language carries culture, that would have a massive effect. And that's just one example. But it would require the entrenchment as well of Indigenous cultures, legal traditions, and it would affect all government institutions because there would be a comparator now, the British and the French, and their position in government institutions, and what about their equal partners? We could, as Canadians, stop hiding from history. As this slide, I think, quite humorously projects. And we could embrace a Canada that we could all celebrate. I borrowed this slide from Pamela's cover of her book. Once this recognition took place, I believe it could be a moment for the ages that all Canadians could celebrate. So I said I would end on a positive note. I'd like to inform you about, and the slide is missing. No, I guess for some reason it didn't get on my stick, but what I'll tell you about it in any event. There's been a movement created around this concept. It's called Recognition 2 action, recognition number 2 action. And it has a website, recognition2action.ca. In the last reporting, the website has reached over 3,677,362 people. Over 1,000 comments and dialogue have occurred on the website, and some of these posts have reached even larger audience. Over 10,000 people have taken action, including sending messages to the Prime Minister, Trudeau, Minister Bennett, and MPs. Many MPs have written back to acknowledge this campaign, and over 1,000 letters, some very powerful that have been published elsewhere, have been sent to politicians, and many have been published in newspapers. One of the high-profile supporters is Margaret Atwood, who has 1.73 million Twitter followers, who has come out very much in support. And there are several Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations who are backing this project. You will see those listed on the website. So there's also universities supporting this, and I would encourage the University of New Brunswick as well to support it, the University of Calgary, Simon Fraser University, and others, the Assembly of First Nations, the National Association of Friendship Centers, and so on, have also signed on. The Assembly of First Nations passed a resolution, in fact, that this should be a project of the Assembly. So it has widespread support, and I would encourage all of you to go to the website and see what you can do. It's a website that's set up on a pyramid type of situation where you can participate just by signing on or giving it a like, or you can write letters by pressing a button. You can send a letter to it's all geared to your postal code area, your MP. You can send a letter to your MP that way, or to the Prime Minister. It's all coded on the website. So that's very, very user-friendly. And there's video material on there. There's a number of articles. So I would encourage you, if you agree with this proposal, to support it. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm supposed to go off blank.
What was the website again?
It's recognition, number 2, action.ca. Make that blank so it's not interfering with your. There. Okay, thank you. This is your phone. Yeah, thanks.
Good morning, everybody. When you hear what I have to say, you're going to think we planned this talk together, but I need a nod from you to say we didn't even discuss any of this. So before we get started, I would actually like to ask of you that we take a few seconds, just a few seconds of your day, to just stop and close your eyes, and first of all, give thanks. I was taught that even if you're agnostic, you could give thanks to somebody that turned the heat up in the room or made lunch for us. And give thanks the way we've been taught to give thanks, and just to be grateful. Think of the things in your life that you're grateful for today. And then after you do that, I'd like you to just extend your thoughts in the best way you can to our brothers and our sisters who have been lost in violent ways from our families and our communities and our nation. And if you don't know anybody who's been lost like that, I want you to add your gratitude for the safety that you have and you know and you trust, and the women and the men and the sisters and brothers in your life, the Two-Spirit and trans people that need that kind of protection. So I just want to take a few seconds to do that. Thank you. I want to, Alan stepped out, but at the sunrise ceremony this morning, he ended with, "I hope you have a chicky day." And so I don't know what that means, but it sounded really good. And so I'm really, really hoping to have a chicky day. And I was grateful for that. So that would be a gratitude that I have. I am grateful this morning for another day to walk on Mother Earth, and that's something that I've been taught to do every single morning when I get up. I'm grateful for the people who've prepared this path for us. I come from the Cree territory. I'm a half-breed from southern Saskatchewan, and the teaching is that the grass dancers prepare the way for us. And so people prepared for us to be here today. People prepared time for us to come and meet on a sacred agreement. And I take that very seriously, and I want to give thanks for the spiritual teachings. Thank you so much. Thank you for a beautiful water and sunrise ceremony this morning that opened my heart in so many ways, and I'm so grateful for it. Thank you, thank you, thank you for that. So we've been spiritually blessed with ceremony and prayer over the last few days, and it would have happened before we got here to prepare for this to come. The protocols would have been followed. We've been fed intellectually. We've had lots of great presentations and talks in the hallways and over lunch and over dinner, and so we've been fed intellectually through this experience over the last few days. We've been fed physically. We had a great lunch yesterday with some salmon, and I see there's some fruit and some beverages out there today, and so we've been physically fed as well. And we've been fed emotionally. Our hearts have been opened to discuss our homeland and the very places we raise our children and live with our families. And so those cover the teachings that I have about how we need to feed ourselves. I was invited to speak at the first conference a couple of years ago, and when I was invited to speak at that time, I tried to imagine, as somebody who comes from a legal teaching as well, what it would be like if we had Indigenous courts looking at our treaties with us rather than non-Indigenous legalistic courts. And so then when I was asked to speak again this year, I thought, what will I talk about? I'm a half-breed from the prairies. My teachings around treaty include and are surrounded and focused on the sacred nature and to always honor the spirit and intent of those covenants, those very sacred agreements, and to find the inherent rights that surround them and are built on what is a solemn relationship, a solemn understanding. So because of that, I'm going to say my ceremonial name, which isn't something that I say lightly or I introduce very often, but when we've been invited to a space to talk about a sacred agreement, I feel an obligation to say that my ceremonial name is Aski-Esqueo, Aski-Oasis, and that means Earth Mother, Earth Child. And I got my ceremonial name in a ceremony after my son, who's now 13, I'm happy to report, had actually physically died in my arms 3 times, and we had been in and out of emergency over and over again. And we had to end up in ceremony. We ended up in a shaking tent ceremony where my son's body was sang back into his soul sang back into his body, and we both received ceremonial names after that. As I imagined what I would talk about when we were talking about ceremony, I started to think about other teachings I have and how I use my voice, and that my voice is something that leaves footprints in your hearts and in your minds. And so, again, I wanted to take really seriously what I had to say to you today. If I'm going to be honored to walk in your heart, I want to be really careful about how I do that. So, what will I do? I have to go back to the teachings of my old people. And in the last few years, I've taken to going into ceremony myself before I go and decide what my talk is going to be, so that I feel good about what's coming out of me and that it comes from my heart. So I started to imagine, if we were talking about treaties, what a grandmother might tell a grandchild about treaties. And that made me think about all the teachings I have, because I'm really fortunate. You'll know from my bio that I'm so lucky I get to work with a lot of elders, and they teach with me at the university, and we go into community, and I have old people around me all the time guiding me and helping me, and I'm very blessed about that. So I've been taught to look at the story that you're going to tell and to select the story that you're going to tell, because all of us have so many stories we could choose from. So how are we going to look at that? And I tried to imagine it like a lens. And so when we talk about treaties and we have a lens that we use, we come at it from this sort of British, or even in some instances French lens. So if you could just imagine for a moment what it would be like to talk about this from a British or a French lens. And I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. You have to use your imagination. What would you imagine that lens would look like? When I was writing my presentation, I imagined, those spy glasses that pirates used to have, and that would be the lens that we're looking through. And so if you could put your spyglass on and imagine what the conversation would look like if we were having a discussion about treaties from a British or French perspective. It's a lens that you've heard about and read about. It's in your mind and on our lips on a pretty regular basis. And the lens that we use, you've heard over and over in the last few days. And we talk about things like pre-Confederate treaties. We talk about peace and friendship treaties, and we talk about them through the 17th and 18th century, in particular the ones that happened within this territory. And we talk about the dates. When you get lawyers in the room, you're always going to talk about the dates. When did that happen, and who was there, and who were the witnesses? So we know we're going to talk about the dates. We might even talk about what you were wearing. We might talk about who the signatories were, because we need to know that the right people were there doing that. That might not be something uncommon to another perspective. You might even talk about the Supreme Court of Canada decisions around the treaties in an effort to make sense of them in light of the honor of the Crown. And we've talked about some legal fictions already this morning, but the honor of the Crown, something that we still pretend is a real legal instrument that we use to peer through the treaties and the agreements that we have with First Nations and Métis and Inuit people in this country. A lens that, if we didn't use the lens of the honor of the Crown, the treaties would be absolutely meaningless. So we all hang on to that in some form. You might actually, through your lens, you might actually see the discussions around Aboriginal and treaty rights in Section 35. We might introduce also the United Nations Declaration into that discussion now, because that's a new instrument. And we end up with a little bit of who's on first and what's on second and where's on third. You might also use your British lens to discuss peace and friendship treaties are not about some things. We've heard over the last few days they're not about land surrenders. What does that mean? So we talk about that. They were used primarily to form military alliances and in aid of settlement. So there's a very distinct perspective coming through our spyglass as we try to understand what the treaties, the peace and friendship treaties from this territory are. You'll know for sure that the treaties contain promises of truck house clauses. When you talk about treaties in the prairies, lots of people don't talk about truck house clauses. We don't have those in the numbered treaties. And so if you talk about them here, you're definitely going to talk about truck house clauses. So that includes trade, what happens with trade, and it includes hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering. I have never been in a discussion for self-government or treaty ever, and I've worked on self-government negotiations across this country, that we haven't talked about hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering. In my own language, that's one word: hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering. Because they're attached to the geography, and they're attached to the people, and they're attached to the settlers, and what they were fighting for at the time. And so the settlement and the hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, and trade become part of that lens. The act of starting a discussion about treaties with dates and Supreme Court decisions of English law, that act alone of discussing treaties right from there is a quick and easy way to dismember the treaty, to take the DNA out of our treaty, to take the very spirit and intent out of that treaty. It dismisses traditions, it dismisses practices, and it dismisses and ignores and renders irrelevant the indigenous laws that went into the making of that treaty, our histories that were poured into that. It ignores everything about the land, the people, the ways, the laws, our relatives. And so we need to take this spyglass away for a while and put our own glasses on. Have you ever done that? Have you ever put someone else's glasses on? And you know as soon as you do, my granddaughter was at my house the other day and she came out of the bathroom and she had my glasses on, and I'm very blind, okay? I know that there's like a purple dot there and a white dot there and stuff. I need my glasses. And she's 4 and she came out of the bathroom and she was walking around like this and said, "Grandma, I'm really dizzy." That's what happens when you put somebody else's glasses on. So keep that in your mind. When you put somebody else's glasses on, they don't quite work for you. And so we have to tell you what you're looking at. We have to explain things, okay? So I just want to keep that in the back of your mind. There's a little reconciliation glasses that we might have to figure out what we're gonna create. And reconciliation has come up a few times, but the word that's come up in the last few days more than any other word is resilience. And as a sideline, I do a lot of research on mental health and lawyers in the legal profession, and a phenomenon that we don't talk about very much. And post-traumatic stress disorder comes up quite often, and that's something that's very common to policing and military and some of our youth, especially children who've been brought up under trauma who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's something else underneath post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's called post-traumatic growth. And it's what happens to you once you've hit that low and you start to bounce up and you bounce higher than you were before. So post-traumatic growth is part of resilience, and it moves in and health is recovered and new skills and insights are strengthened and grown and developed, and we're empowered by it. So I want to think about that in terms of resilience and what we do and how we do it. So you've taken off your spyglass now and you need to put on some new lenses. We're going to look at the treaties from an Indigenous perspective. And so if you were raised in ceremony or if you've ever attended ceremony, you're going to know that when you truly want to understand something, it's actually not a glass that you take off and put on to look out. You would close your eyes, and our vision quests are something that are a very internal process. So if you're going to imagine treaty through the lens of Indigenous people, you actually have to go inside to be able to do that. And so what would that look like? The Indigenous lens of the Mi'kmaq or the can you help me say this? Wolastoqey or Passamaquoddy even version would quite likely begin with something that Catherine mentioned this morning. We would actually probably start the whole discussion from creation stories. We would talk about our origins. That would be the place that we would start. Not from British law, not from Canadian court decisions, but we would start from our creation stories. And that would make sense to us, and it would make sense to children, and it would make sense to our teachers. And when you're dealing with creation stories, you're naturally in a particular season, because creation stories are shared in a particular season, and there would be teachings around that. And it matters what season it is, because there are laws about that, and who shares it, and when, and how. And certain protocols would have been followed prior to those discussions and those teachings. So if you could imagine you're now going inside and you've got the proper teachers who have got their own teachings about this, and we're in a certain setting, in a certain season, then the smells of medicine and the natural elements would be at play all around you. And so now I want not just your internal vision to be activated, but your ears are really keen and your nose is engaged. You can smell the teachings. The person whose job it is to keep those teachings would be sharing them. Because we have historians, and we have lodge keepers, and we have lawyers. Now, I'm not professing to be any kind of historian on the local history here. I don't want to put that image out there at all. I don't know the local practices and traditions from this territory. I haven't been taken in by any elders here, and I don't want to pretend that it's been like that. What I do know is that in order to discuss sacred ideals, there would be some basic information that would be foundational to the speakers and to the listeners, to the people that are visioning this with you. And I do know there would be a common understanding, the law of the area, if you will, a common understanding. And there'd be some basic legal principles for the relationship between any animate beings that are in the neighborhood. Those are the reality, and there's something that we can loosely understand in English as spiritual law. So I understand from the teachings that I have that it would be common in many, many of the lands here that there would be spiritual law, and there would be something that we could loosely understand in English as natural law. And so we've got spiritual law and natural law, and then we have something that we can call human-made law. And human laws that are created as a result of an understanding of spiritual law and the laws of nature. And so when you are starting with that as your foundation, you're now in ceremony and trying to understand the treaties. So bear with me as I ask you to imagine that our spyglass lookers are trying to see what we're seeing. They're trying to see laws from a spiritual source, laws that come from nature, laws that understand the grandfather wind, rock, they understand water and understand fire and the roles that those elements have agreed spiritually to play in our lives, and when they show up, what it means. Going a little bit further, we also need to understand that these laws are knowable and accessible. I hear a lot of conversations that say we're losing our ways. We know from our teachers, and you've been exposed to Imelda and David for 2 days now, and many of you for more than that. She's tapping us. She's telling us, remember who you are. She's using her songs and she's using her teachings. And the smells of the medicines and the water. She talked about the ceremony this morning. She's saying, remember who you are. And so we're going to take those teachings and we're going to say, we've earned some of this information, and there are ceremonial people who will look after us through this. We need to understand truly that the laws that we look at, the relationships that we're trying to understand through these teachings are very complex. That the teachings that come through as those are traditions and practices and might include somebody smudging you, include teachings of quantum physics, astronomy, geology, and that we have scientists among us. And they're responsible for that information, for keeping it and for passing it on. And to understand our spiritual and natural laws, you have to be reminded of the teachings. And Imelda mentioned one yesterday. She talked about the 13 moons. And if you're learning about the 13 moons, the teachings of the turtle will come into those teachings. And then you're going to have to understand the teachings of that turtle. That's a huge teaching. The ecology, if you just think about this for a moment, all the kinds of turtles there are, where they live, how they thrive, what threatens them, what they feed. You would have to understand all of those teachings to understand the moon teachings. You would need to understand the cycles. If you're going to understand the teachings of the moon, you need to understand what cycles are and how they're impacted. You need to know about water and about tides and about moon time for women. You need to understand about procreation. And you need to know that there's a grandmother that's looking after the moon. And then we're going to talk about the healers and the midwives. And we're going to have an understanding then of kinship law. And so you can see that our teachings and our experts and our specialists and our laws are all folded into these teachings. A discussion about water will necessarily bring in teachings of the swimmers. And there's a lot of swimmers. There's swimmers we've never met. The people, the beings that live under the water, in the water. And if you're going to understand water, and you're going to understand the grandmother water that feeds us and keeps us alive, and how it can creep into any place and seep into your life, you're going to understand that it is the milk of Mother Earth, and that it is a force to be reckoned with. It's very, very powerful, and it's life-sustaining. And if you talk about the moon, then we're also going to have to talk about the sun and the stars. And this would lead into a discussion about interdependence of those beings and how they play a role in our life. And if we start to talk about the stars and the sun and the moon, we're soon going to come to a teaching of thunder beings. And then we're going to have to talk a little bit about the wind and the force of the wind and the purpose, why Yutin in Cree is important and a spirit that we have to honor and respect. What does the wind teach us when he shows up and when he leaves? And how is he a relative? And how do we honor that relationship? What's the language? Because Yutin sits in our breath, and it's been part of every breath of every human, of every being. Every being. You have to just think about that for a second. You know, there's a poet in British Columbia that says, I can't translate my poems for you from Salish because I don't know how to say in English a teaching that says, my breath is your breath, and it's been to the other side of the world and back, and it's been to the stars and back, and every being on the planet has had that very same breath. Imelda again talked to us about that baby's first song, that first breath and what it means and where it comes from. If you're talking about the sun and the moon, we're talking about the environment, you're talking about the wind, we're talking about lightning, we're talking about natural law. Okay, I'm just getting started. So you're starting to get an understanding of what it takes to make a treaty, of the pieces that go into it, of the teachings, of how many people it takes to bring that into being. So now we've come through some natural elements and what we'd have to see to understand the role and the interdependentness and the relatedness of the plant kingdom, the standing people, the shrubs, the grasses, the flowers, our medicines, the four sacred grasses that are common among many, many of our Indigenous people across this turtle. They all have a language that we're all taught about that. We have specific people that will teach us about that. We have herbalists and botanists. We have ecologists working with us now. We have pharmacologists. We have medicine keepers. We've always had that. The next thing we might see through our Indigenous lens or our vision might be the stories. Now, I've talked a little bit about the swimmers. We might see the stories of the flyers. We might understand our dependence on the crawlers and the four-leggeds. Yesterday, you had a teaching that when you put your moccasins on and you're honored with moccasins and you go into, for example, in a Sundance ceremony where I go, you would get brand new moccasins for that. And Imelda taught you yesterday that's to honor the four-leggeds, that is the hide of the four-leggeds. And they've made an agreement with us to be honored in that way. That's a treaty. Once we've taken these teachings in, we would be obligated to see our role and our responsibilities within that worldview. We would have to understand the land and the stewardship. We would have to understand the ceremonies and the laws related to being, living on, and being of the land. Part of it, we're interdependent. I have a teacher that says, we are the smallest part of creation and dependent on all us. And if all humans disappeared from the planet, she would be much better off. And so I think about that and how small we are. We would be taught that we can only take what we need because we have other relatives. The four-leggeds, the flyers, the crawlers, the swimmers, the plants are also reliant on our mother. So we have to leave something for them, and we have to leave something for future generations. This teaches us about biology, ecology, chemistry, organisms, and ecosystems. So in order that we can live, we have to live in a certain way together because we're all here to stay. How many times have we heard that quote in the last decade? We are all here to stay. It does not just apply to humans. We need to see that we have treaties, for example, with the four-leggeds, and we have treaties with something as small as a firefly. I have an elder that came to teach with me, and we were teaching at an Indigenous Peoples Land Management program. And it was very late, and it was late in August. And when I asked her to come, she said, I won't get my medicines picked if I come and teach with you. And I said, please. We were going out in the bush, and it was land managers from all over the country. And so she finally agreed to come with me. And we were having a fire one night, and the fireflies came out. And she had a PhD student sitting beside her, and she said, you see those fireflies right there? And he said, yes. And she said, I can't pick my medicines now. And he said, why not? And she said, because I have a contract with those fireflies. I need some of that medicine, and so do they. And once they show up, that's my sign not to pick anymore. And so this very young man who's doing his PhD was extremely confused about what she meant about having, who would sign the contract with a firefly? And so treaties for us are long-standing agreements and understandings that we have with all of our relatives. Once we see that we've got these stories of understandings and how we're going to live together, there will be teachings as well about conflict with us and some of our relatives. There'll be conflicts over where to live, who gets the food, how to take it. And so there would be teachings on the treaties within the people, within our relatives, after careful consideration and after ceremony about how we will do that. How will we come to an agreement about that? And if we're using our Indigenous lens to see this, we know that there'd be stories of those times that were passed down, how they were passed down, how peace was kept. We would know there would be stories about treaties with other Indigenous nations. We know that we didn't start treaties in 1725. We would know what borders were. We would know what trading was. We would know about hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering because we've already got treaties with other beings. We would understand about foods and medicines. So, as I mentioned, I'm just getting started. I have a teacher in Saskatchewan that says, I would love to tell you the story of the firefly, but that's a 3-day story, and we would have to camp together, and there would be songs that would have to be sung. And I haven't talked to you about language. I haven't begun to list the ceremonies and rituals and teachings around the practices. I have not talked about the apprenticeship that goes on with those teachings or the selection of the people into the professions that I've mentioned, and I've only mentioned a few of those. I have not told you that each element, each one of the relatives that you can imagine when I say swimmers, crawlers, four-leggeds, and flyers, the standing people, the medicines, have their own teaching, their own language, their own stories. I haven't begun to list the responsibilities around each of those relationships, and I haven't even mentioned consequences at all. And there in Cree, we talk about Pastahawin, Otsinawin, the teachings of natural consequence. When you break laws, what happens, where those teachings come from. What have I done? What have I hoped to do today with you is that I hoped I introduced you to a movie in your mind with teachings from treaty from a completely different perspective. One that includes family, healing, learning, teaching, living, working, birth, death, talking, taking, giving. This, my friends, is the DNA of treaty from an Indigenous perspective. The teaching from Imelda, when we smudge in front, she said this morning, you remember your DNA, you remember your ancestral line, where you come from, how you have come to be who you are today. We get a glimpse of our inherent gifts, the responsibility that we take on when we agree in the spirit world to come to the earth at all. What we call in our legal language inherent rights, we know in Indigenous perspectives that those are actually responsibilities. So sure, treaty is about hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, and trade. And if you say it really fast, you get an idea of a guy in camouflage out with a fishing rod and a rifle to go do something and maybe bring it home, sell it later, or trade it for some goods. But that's the thinnest slice of what a treaty could be. Treaties are solemn, sure. Between nations, sure. But the teachings of treaty from an Indigenous perspective are so much richer than that. They are an agreement about relationships. They're another agreement to take what you need, to respect the other party in that agreement, and to think about the future. There's roles for women who own half the sky and half the earth, and roles for men who own half the sky and half the earth. There's guidance from elders, teachings from children, understandings and teachings from our magic people and our two-spirit and trans communities. There's ceremony to set the path. Treaties are hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, and trade, and that's one story that we could tell. It could be expanded to reveal what people ate, the societies, how they were ordered, responsibilities taken on, how ceremonies were prepared and fed and held, and where and why and what season and who could attend them. Treaties are, in fact, about education, justice, social responsibility, kinship, spirituality, interdependence on the land, political decision-making. I think you get the picture. If we did this from an Indigenous perspective, it would be far more inclusive than a piece of paper with the agreement from one perspective in a language no one could speak that was on the other side of that document. So I want to just thank you for taking a little journey with me from your spyglass to your own internal visioning. And I want to say thank you again to the organizers. It was a great, great conference, and I'm very, very happy to have been invited again. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. My question would be to Kathleen. And why were the Catholic Church exempt from compensation to residential school survivors?
Why were they absent? I don't quite understand.
Why were they exempt
They were
from?
not.
Pardon?
The Catholic Church was not exempt. The Catholic Church in the settlement agreement was responsible, along with all the other churches. The court held for 25% of all the harms. So the Catholic Church entered into agreement with Canada to reimburse them for the money that they would have paid the survivors on the church's behalf. All the churches entered into reimbursement agreements with Canada. So even though when you see a legal action, it's the survivors versus Canada, it's also against the churches. So that there was no letting off the hook of the churches.
Just one more quick question,
Sure.
please, if you don't mind. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Since we are awards of the Crown, so why can't we not sue the government for negligence, for not having clean water, proper food, proper housing, so on and on, as you know, all the problems First Nations are facing. So would it be possible for us to sue the government for negligence?
Anything is possible, really, in terms of legal actions. Usually, those matters are settled by agreement just to avoid, the long, prolonged, expensive court processes. But some have gone. I mean, as we know, there's a lot of treaty litigation before the courts in terms of what's supposed to be provided and what's not being provided. I would use the child welfare example, which I'm sure Marilyn is very, very aware of and involved with. And you can see the difficulties of, litigation. And that's gone on for years, and Canada has still not paid the difference between what Indigenous children should be receiving from the child welfare pot compared to non-Indigenous children. They've been told by the Canadian Human Rights Commission repeatedly that they have to do that. So it becomes a political issue ultimately. And that's where, the politics of the Indigenous representatives and the Canadian representatives come into play. And my own view about the politics right now that we're living is there's never been a better time to advance the Indigenous causes. The Prime Minister, in his mandate letters, for example, to the Minister of Indian Affairs, now there's two ministers, are very clear that they're going to make fundamental change. But I think so far, this has been a lot of talk. There hasn't been a lot of movement. So I think it's really incumbent upon, the people of Canada to hold the feet to the fire of the politicians. And, we're up halfway through the mandate of the federal government right now. And I think if people raise their voices and organize and lobby, nothing happens without pressure. Equality has never happened ever anywhere in the world without fighting for it. It never happens on its own. And I think the same is true about Indigenous rights. I think that, Canada won't do what it says it's going to do without pressure. And I think that it's up to all of us to ensure that that happens. And this is part of this campaign that I spoke about. It needs to be taken to the next level, in my view, now, and have, organizations take it on in a very meaningful way, if they believe in it, of course. But things aren't just going to happen when people sit back and hope they happen. That's not the way human rights works. That's not the way equality works. That's not the way civil rights work. There's always has to be participation, and people have to fight for those rights.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hi, my question is for Professor Mahoney. So you propose this piece of legislation as an act of recognition, yes, as a way of kind of getting around the need for a constitutional amendment. but you said that the legislation would be quasi-constitutional or could be quasi-constitutional. I guess I'm wondering what kind of mechanisms you envision being built into the legislation that give it teeth, that actually bring it up to that kind of a level so that you can actually cause it to be an agent of change.
Okay, thank you for that question. It's a very important question. There is draft legislation on the website, and would certainly welcome comments and critiques of that. It was just an attempt to show what it could look like. And what is in that draft is certain mechanisms, such as reporting mechanisms, et cetera, that would require the government to report on assuming the legislation is passed, to report on the content of that legislation, the progress that has been made on the legal requirements of it. And so in drafting that legislation, the inspiration came from documents such as the Charlottetown Accord, such as the Multiculturalism Act, such as other pieces of legislation in other jurisdictions. So have a look at it. See what you think, and certainly about the enforcement mechanisms. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
We have a question over here.
I just want to add something to that. You know, we have reciprocal enforcement agreements between provinces and between us and other countries on all kinds of issues. And there's no reason that we couldn't have a piece of legislation like that and have reciprocal agreements and laws within our nations that feed into that and that are mutually respectful, so that it's not just a top-down approach into Indigenous communities. And so I think we need to start talking about what our legislation would look like as well.
So for Professor Mahoney, I would like to suggest that you do your teaching to the CBC people, because last time when they do the history of Canada, they completely forget two people, not only one, the indigenous people, and the second were the Acadian. So, and I'm not very happy that you put the French and the British on the same level in the history, because French, since 1759, are also the victims of the British Crown. So if you see a lot of, and including like Manitoba is a good example, where the French language was completely washed out from the Manitoba on the legal side. And it's, here in New Brunswick, every day is a fight for French communities or so. And I don't know if you were there for when the senator was there yesterday, we have the church story also here, is French and the indigenous church we are jeopardized by the Bishop of St. John. So I think we need to put this in perspective. Now for all First Nation people, indigenous, unfortunately, you are in Canada and not in Europe. Because in Europe, you will be able to sue directly your government under the European Human Rights Court. And then the government will be fined, and you will be obligated by a supranational bodies. Unfortunately for us in Canada, we do not have this supranational court where we can sue directly the government, because the Supreme Court, the judge is still appointed by the government. So they're still not independent of the government of Canada. So this is a problem here. But we need to create then first, but not today because with Trump, but we need first to create the American Union and then have a supranational court system, and then we will be able to sue our government for whatever reason.
Okay, that's an interesting comment, but I would like to comment on your question about the French-speaking Canadians. If you look at the BNA Act, which is the foundational document of Confederation, you will see that the French language and the English language are protected constitutionally. You will see that civil law and common law are protected, and that's really that's basically what we have in Canada. Quebec is run by civil law. The rest of the country is by British common law. Indigenous law is nowhere to be seen, and that's what recognition, in my opinion, would lead much more towards. I'd also like to comment that I think if this recognition legislation were to become reality, it would strengthen the French reality and their distinct society, because it's another recognition of distinctiveness in Canada, that we're not all the same. We do have different cultures, histories, languages, and systems of law, except there's this massive gap for the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So the Acadians, yes, they're a special sort of case in Canada that have, you're absolutely right, consistently fought for the French language. They have much less attention, it seems to me, than the French in Canada, but I do believe that strengthening the confederation and the recognition of the parties to it would also strengthen French throughout Canada. There's French-speaking people in Alberta, for example, who have some rights that are recognized for education in French in schools. There's some in Manitoba, but maybe that's not as sufficient for people that live there. But I do believe this would make their case stronger.
Thank you both for a wonderful and really deep, rich presentation. And I have a question for both of you. Kathleen, to use your the sense of implicit, I want to kind of come back to that, but I was a little bit amused by the idea of quasi-legislation. In the United States, the federal government has developed this, through the courts, have developed this concept called, when it's applied to Indian nations, quasi-sovereignty, quasi-sovereign peoples kind of thing. It reminds me of the Diet Coke of sovereignty, looks like sovereignty, but it's not quite sovereignty kind of thing, And I'm wondering, and I think I mentioned this with Ian's presentation and Pam's yesterday, that we're looking to create maybe a response, maybe a new way or a different way to get to the crux of the matter of why the federal government is resisting the obvious. We're trying to do the feds' work in the sense of trying to make it easier for the feds to respond, to do what they're supposed to be doing. But I can't help think about the already existing constitutional mandate to honor inherent rights, to honor the treaties, both in Section 25 and 35. I think it's a matter of getting at the heart of why there's such a resistance in the federal government on all levels to simply enforce the Constitution. The rule of law, has been used in many devious ways, but we're talking about a pretense when we're using the rule of law. It's pretentious to think that the rule of law has been enforced when in actuality it's not. And I think just the simplicity of enforcing what already exists, the mandates that already exist, without having to do anything new. I think of us terrorists in Burnt Church, for instance, when we're trying to defend, the sovereignty of community decision to manage the fishery, the sovereignty of that, and the RCMP's show of force, as they did in Elsie Puktuk. In my warped way of thinking, the RCMP is charged with enforcing the mandate of the Constitution, and they should have been defending the rights of Indigenous peoples, so we don't have to go out there alone. But the RCMP should be there. That's the rule of law. It's a constitutional mandate. So you have a comment on that?
Yes, I do. And you're perfectly correct to say that Section 25 and Section 35 are there. They're implicit. They are constitutional. My argument is that this needs to be explicit. I think it's very important that the notion of equality, the notion of foundational importance needs to be embedded in our identity as Canadians. I think that it's too easy for law enforcement, politicians, and so on to push to the side the Indigenous rights, the Indigenous reality in Canada because of a whole sorts of difficulties in dealing with it. For example, we went to the Minister of Heritage, Madame Jolie, to present this as this would be the perfect 150th anniversary flagship for the Department of Heritage if they were to pronounce either on Aboriginal Day or on July the 1st that there would be recognition legislation finally, that Confederation doesn't mean anything to Canada without including the founders of Canada in that in our laws. And we were told that this is too hard. It's too hard. And what does that mean? It means that they don't want to come to grips with it because politically it's not something that they're being forced to do. And I stress again that any change towards human rights and equalities has never been done voluntarily. It always requires people that want those rights and demand those rights to argue for them. The challenge then becomes how to use the tools that are available, and the social media is a powerful tool. I mean, when we've reached 3.6 million people already in a campaign that started just a few months ago, that can build over time and have a very powerful influence on politicians. And let's face it, politicians always think about how they're going to be reelected. And when you're only 2 or 3% of the population spread across this vast country, there's not much leverage there. So it seems to me the leverage will be created with coalescing with other groups, i.e. non-Indigenous groups, and we're tapping into the generation that is Mr. Trudeau's base, the millennial generation. Those are the primary people who are spreading this campaign. And eventually they will sit up and take notice because it'll start to threaten their political position. And I think that's the way in which something like this has to be done. And similarly, the RCMP. I mean, look at, for example, sexual harassment in the RCMP. It's gone on for decades and decades and decades, but only when individuals start speaking up and it's publicized is that they start to make change because they're embarrassed, their mandate is undermined, and they look very bad. And so it's the same with something like this, in my view. Let's see, I was going to say something else. I think the movement is in the right direction. There's movement happening. John Burroughs has had a tremendous effect at the University of Victoria with the Indigenous law program that he has started there. And it's not going to be long before UVic starts graduating students with dual degrees, not civil law and common law, but Indigenous law and common law. There's a judge and the former Chief Justice of the British Columbia Supreme Court has stated publicly and continues to talk about this, that it's a lawyer's duty to learn Indigenous law in addition to the common law and the civil law that we teach in law schools. And there's more and more people realizing that our legal system is incomplete and that the rule of law is undermined because of that. And when the rule of law is undermined, you have less respect for the law. And when you have less respect for the law, you start to have a very unhealthy society. So, it's a bunch of factors that have to come together, and people have to, work together on this project or other projects, whether it be, treaty recognition or what have you. But it's my view that this would be the ultimate act of reconciliation. If there's recognition, when you think about it, is everything. Even within a family, if a child is not recognized by its family, it creates huge dysfunction in that child's idea of who they are and where they fit in the world. If a family is not recognized in their community, similarly, if a culture or a group of people is not recognized in their city or their province or their country, which is what I'm talking about, it just creates a sense of non-belonging and anger and feelings of inequality and discrimination. So the fact that it's quasi-constitutional, that's a very pragmatic approach. Pragmatically speaking, a constitutional amendment or a rewrite of the Constitution would not happen. I mean, ideally, we would sit down and rewrite the BNA Act and write it as if Indigenous peoples were at the table or put them at the table. But that's not likely going to ever happen. But
to make explicit recognition in a piece of legislation, it seems to me, would have the same effect. You don't hear the Supreme Court judges demanding that the Supreme Court Act be written into the Constitution because they know it's constitutional, as a matter of fact. The government would never dream of repealing that act unless we were taken over by some kind of dictator or something like that didn't want to mind the decisions of the Supreme Court. Similarly, like I mentioned, the other foundational pieces of legislation in this country aren't all in the Constitution. So I don't think it's a huge problem to have a piece of legislation, recognition legislation, passed and see it actually becoming or really being constitutional, even though we're not amending the Constitution to put it in.
I hope that the inclusion of your email address wasn't by accident, because I say that we're going to have further conversations. You'll be hearing from me.
All right, and there's another, if you want to see what I was talking about in terms of the activity that's happened on the website, I said the website was recognition2, just go recognition2action.ca, and if there's a / take action, ! It will give you what's going on and what suggestions there are for taking action. But the main website, recognition2action.ca, is there, and I'm sure there's links to the take action piece as well.
I meant your personal email.
Oh, my personal email. I don't mind having my personal email. I'll answer your emails if you care to send me one.
I'm going to throw one more thought into that. You know, one of the things that came through the calls to action, and I think that Senator Sinclair talks about, is having a new proclamation, and what would it look like to have a Canadian proclamation, and to reconsider what that looks like. And so we could look at what the instrument is and create it. I'm all about looking for new processes and new instruments that are representative of everybody's interests. And I think using the same tools to try to dismantle the Master's House has not been successful for us. And so what would we do that would be a little bit different? And so the thinking that Catherine's proposed to you this morning, the thinking that's in this particular website, and the thinking through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think are all pointing in the direction of something that's got a bigger bang than what we have already. What could that be?
Well, maybe that's a segment into what I wanted to share with you. First of all, wow. Thank you, Marilyn. I'm a proponent. It reminds me of the discussion about creating new treaties. And particularly as it was the context was new treaties for the maritime kind of thing. And I'm still reluctant about advancing anything new within the structures, within the systems, if they don't come, if they haven't employed the first one to begin with. If we're not creating a relationship that, well, I don't think it's implicit. I think the treaties are very explicit. I think the foundations of a constitutional mandate in Section 25 and 35 are pretty explicit. It's just that we're not paying any attention to it, kind of thing. And that's the aberration about the rule of law, the pretense of it. But I want to thank you for sharing the perspective of what it takes in Indian country, the process that it takes, and the considerations that it takes when we enter into agreements, when we make families, when we create treaties in this sense. Understanding that creating treaties with other indigenous nations, was a process that was extended to the colonials. And I guess I'm kind of reminded about what Bertram Russell once said, that working within and I think both Kathleen and you have stated this, that working within the existing systems, when the existing system is very dysfunctional, is an invitation to create something new, as you've indicated, which in creating something new, it makes the existing systems obsolete. And I think I think maybe that's where we're going. But I have a lot of hope for what was already accomplished, what was already set in the wampum, through the ceremonies, through our relationship with the sacred. And I'm more thinking about what is the psychology of resistance from the Canadian government and, frankly, the Canadian people, that I think most people see it, and I think it, as you're referring to in the movement, most people want to do something different and something that's real, and that's the inspiration that I feel coming from this. I don't necessarily think we have to invent the wheel. I think we just have to agree with what we already agreed with, and to give that life. So, Marilyn, thank you for that perspective. I think one of the big differences, as you were sharing that, between the British lens and the Indigenous lens is a matter of time. And you reminded me about when the English came to these territories and they seen all this land and they seen what appeared to be vacant property wasn't really vacant, because we took into consideration the moose and the deer and the four-leggeds in the trees having their own, needing their own space, and it was very respected to that. And we knew where those traditional territories were because we have names for everything. We knew every square inch of that territory. So I want to thank you for that that perspective very much. And like my threat to Catherine, you'll probably be hearing from me.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. I was thinking about the question that got asked to Senator Christmas last night about, because I have chiefs that I work with in Saskatchewan that say, I don't vote in provincial and municipal and Canadian elections because I'm sovereign. And it's a teaching from my father, and it was a teaching from his father, and it's a teaching from his father. When you're sovereign, you don't vote in each other's elections. We don't vote in the American election. We don't want Canadians voting in the local elections here. And then Catherine's comments today about where that clout is and how our political leaders are positioning themselves. The language is, are you a taxpayer? The language is, we're halfway through a mandate. How are we going to ensure we get another mandate? And so what do we use to put pressure? I don't know what that pressure looks like, but what could it look like? And I wonder if we're all wishing for something new or if we're all wishing to just do something, because I think talking about it, which is really important, to be careful before you step. We're feeling frustrated by that, and it's not maybe getting us to the spaces that we thought it was going to get us to. I was on the airplane with an artist. I mentioned this to some people. I was on an airplane with an artist from British Columbia, or from Yellowknife, that was coming to a show here, and he was telling me that his 10-year-old son asked him, "Dad, they finished going to a treaty day, and he said, 'Dad, if I give them their $5 back, will they listen to us?'" And so even our children are trying to imagine, what would it take to get people to listen to us, right? I've been thinking a lot about democracy. I've worked on Métis elections in Saskatchewan, and don't get me started. We've got all kinds of issues around elections in Saskatchewan, and thinking about what democracy means and how we get that democratic muscle going. Because as a First Nation with the second largest land mass in the world, we are very proud of the fact that we're a democratic nation. And I'm wondering about discussions around principles of democracy and inclusion and what that means and what it could mean and what it means to look after each other and who needs to make those. And some of the things that you just mentioned actually have really, really hit that home for me. So I just thank you so much for the comments that you've made over the last few days, and to everybody's questions. It's really putting something in my brain to make me try to understand it from a different perspective, which I think is our job. And so just thank you again to everybody.
Hi. So this question is for both of you or anyone, but it's definitely prompted by Kathleen's talk. So Kathleen, you said that the opportunity to set the record straight is upon us. And given the current UN Genocide Convention's distinction of what actions constitute genocide, it is clear that Canadian government, both provincially and federally, has personally carried out genocidal acts, as well as having supported organizations that have done the same. Can you explain how the Canadian government has managed to go uncharged for genocide without the added distinction of cultural genocide? I personally would argue that that distinction of cultural genocide waters down the issue. It waters down what happened in Canadian history and the perceived responsibilities of non-Indigenous citizens and government in healing historic trauma. I would argue that distinguishing this as cultural genocide instead of genocide does not truly set the record straight. Just wondering what you have to say about that.
That's a very good question, and it's something that I've thought about a lot, actually. One thing I'd just say as a footnote to your question is that, you know, back in the day, post-World War II, when the Genocide Convention was being drafted, cultural genocide was in the definition, and guess how it got removed? Our representative at that table was the Nobel Prize winning Prime Minister, later, Lester B. Pearson. At the time, he was Foreign Affairs Minister. And Pearson insisted that cultural genocide be removed from the definition and said Canada would refuse to sign unless it was. And he was successful in getting that removed. No doubt thinking and being advised that one day in the future, the Indigenous people would come forward and argue that Canada was guilty of cultural genocide. And actually, that's the strongest case that could be made. What you're asking me for really is the legal argument, and that's what it would be under the Genocide Convention, because the Genocide Convention talks about killing members of a group. It talks about destroying the artifacts of the members of a group. It talks about removing children from one group and placing them in another group. And all of that has to be shown to have the intent of destroying the group. So it would come down to whether or not, you know, a decision maker in the International Court of Justice would be convinced that the state, the Canadian state, had that, what we call in law mens rea, had that intent to destroy the Aboriginal people of this country. The problem with, I mean, I could go on and on this, but the problem, and I think you nodded when I said removing the children one group and putting with another group, the problem with that is that factually, most of the children, some of them of course died, many died in the residential schools and they weren't returned to their group, but they died mostly of disease. As we know from the Wenjack story, some of them died from running away. But most of them were returned to their communities. So that would weaken, from a legal standpoint, the argument. And as I said, this is a legal argument at the end of the day. And so many people talked about bringing a case before the UN or before the International Court of Justice. And I think that it hasn't been done because of the complications of taking such a case, the expense, etc., the relative weakness in terms of the legal argument that could be made. And the question is, what would this do that would be better than what's been done already? And the settlement agreement for First Nations people, Métis and Inuit, covered the residents that went to the residential school. As I mentioned, or somebody mentioned, it's the largest settlement in Canadian history, and actually it's the largest settlement of its kind in the world. The only settlement that's larger than our settlement is the German agreement with the Jewish population because of the Holocaust. And, but that's not holistic like this agreement is. So you have to ask what would be achieved by taking it to the international sphere. That would be more than what we have now, which is always a pragmatic question in terms of, legal strategies. And would it do anything more than what's been done? What's also been done, as you know, since the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement is there's been acknowledgement of Newfoundland, Labrador schools. There was a settlement there. There's been a settlement agreement with respect to the 60s scoop. And now lawyers are working on the settlement agreement for day scholars. So, a lot of doors have been opened to deal with the other genocidal or quasi-genocidal activities of the state of Canada. So, I'm not saying that it's not possible. Definitely the law is there. It could be used. But I guess ultimately people ask themselves, is it worth it? What would it resolve? What would it do to make the situation better? I personally not so sure it would do a whole lot. Give some satisfaction, I suppose, and some historical markers. But Canada's admitted liability for what it's done. It hasn't admitted to genocide. But it's pretty powerful that the Chief Justice of Canada decided to say that, use the word genocide, and she's been heavily criticized for that. But she did say cultural genocide, but as I pointed out in preface to this answer, that would have been genocide but for the intervention of Lester B. Pearson and others who didn't want to face up one day to the fact that their states had participated in the cultural destruction of groups within their countries. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my views on it.
No, it definitely does. Yeah. Draws some more questions, but yeah, thank you.
I think that I'll add the comment that if we were talking to the survivors of residential school violence experiment, if we were talking to people who've survived any kind of violence in our communities, especially people who've been removed through the number of scoops that have started in the 40s actually and are still going on today, they would say, what do I want? I want it to stop. So the question would be, would taking action to an international forum and labeling it in a way that would shame the country internationally stop that behavior from happening? Because quite frankly, more lawyers got rich off settlement money and off scoop money than any individual did. And so there's not much repair happening that way. That's something that's up to our communities and us to deal with. And so what do we want to happen? We want it to stop. When you talk to families who come to the inquiry, they say, if you say, what do you want? They say, we want it to stop. We want the police to stop raping. We want the police to start taking us seriously. We want our women to be safe in our communities and on the street. They want it to stop. So if an international action would bring that, it's the right one, right? So it's a very, very good question to contemplate. Maybe.
Absolutely wonderful presentation. Thank you for bringing us that good news, to our territory. And I just wanted to add, what Senator Lovelace was saying about the unjust and what's happened to our communities and the responsibility of the powers that need to give back to us. One of the things that I always felt was it's not that we want the money, even though it would help. It's our language that needs to be put back in the place where it was before they came. And so right now with Health Canada, I actually tell Health Canada I need funding for language as my healer. And so we're working on these programs in different communities, but it's such a small grassroots movement. But I'm wondering, maybe through, Kathleen, that website, we can talk about why we have to institute, I know that I don't like that word, that's why we changed Mi'kmaq Maliseet institution to Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey Center, because institution just sounds bad. But we need to affirm that our language is a resource, and it needs to be protected in the same way we protect our air, we protect our earth, or protect our water and all those elements, because even all of those, the swimmers, the crawlers, we do, and like, Gisitanomok said, we have names for that. So our language is definitely present. It's the speakers we need. And so we need that support of in recruiting speakers. I've always argued, I used to teach at Fredericton High School, and I was really upset that my students had to choose between French or their own language. And I'm going, wait a minute, what if they don't want to take English? Maybe they want French and Maliseet. Why is your English language so protected over any other language? That's unfair. And how do I treat my students and teach them about honoring all languages if they have to choose because the non-Indigenous language groups have decided to separate themselves? So it's unfair. And I'm still fighting it. Because I feel it should be open to anybody that wants to take it and not just for Indigenous students. I mean, I was even put in a social study, office as opposed to a language office. So my language wasn't considered a language. It was a social studies. So I stayed for 3 years, but I told my students when I said goodbye to them, I said, I can't tokenize my language in this setting because I have to set a precedent that our language will not be treated like a token. You can have your language, but it's just for your people. That's an insult. And so at least at the university, it's open to everybody. But I want all those departments, health, education, all of those departments, resources, natural resources. Language has to be a part of that. It can't just be an add-on. It has to be central, the vein that keeps all of us alive in this country. I'd
just make one short comment, and that is that about the website. What's happened over the months is it has become a platform, to answer your question, Imelda, it's become a platform for a number of discussions about various issues, which all are relative to the notion of recognition. So, it's one social media tool that's out there that has multiplied exponentially to serve as a place where people can come and talk about this, and the dialogue has started on a number of issues. So I would encourage you again to check it out. Yeah, great to meet you too.
Well, thank you very much, ladies. On behalf of the organizers, we certainly have a presentation to show our appreciation. We want to thank both of you for coming to our territory and sharing your knowledge and your educational efforts.
Thank you.
I also want to thank you for your presentation. I like your ideas about recognition. I think it's time that we recognize here. And I think it's important for and thank you. The Indigenous perspective it's important. One thing I noticed when I listen to the different perspectives, you know, one thing Western perspective just totally ignores the culture, the knowledge systems behind the treaties, you know, and the world views. And I want to thank you for reminding us that this is an important perspective in looking at treaties. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yes.
Thank you so much.